Okay, so welcome to the main event. I'm Christopher Reddy. I'm the correspondence secretary, helping to facilitate meetings and so on. And I'm here to introduce our speaker tonight, Jim Adams. So Jim's a longtime member of the society and a resident of the Runnymede neighborhood. Let's read sort of the official stuff we have here. Coinciding with our AGM will be guest speaker Jim Adams, who's delivering a talk, Runnymede, the in-between neighborhood. So tucked up in between three well-known neighborhoods and a set of railway tracks, Runnymede is a small but packed with history dating back 13,000 years when it was a beach. Jim Adams, whose family has lived in the Junction, Bloor West, and Runnymede neighborhoods since the 1880s, is a newly minted historian with training in both journalism and creative writing, and will lead you through an overview of the compact area's history. So with that, welcome Jim. Thank you. It's hard to follow up after this.
Maybe try the space bar.
Yeah, there we go, thank you. I start off with my own acknowledgement, even though we've already heard one. And while we're reading through that, it takes a lot in order to get right of the history. It's just not me who's sitting at my computer and researching stuff. It's this organization has helped. Madeline McDowell has been an incredible source of information for me. Helen Mills, The Lost Rivers of Ontario. The Toronto Carrying Place by Glenn Turner, a book that this guy walked the length of the carrying place, I think it's 45 kilometers. Toronto Archives, which I'm going to tomorrow. Mississauga Golf and Country Club, of all places, has been very helpful, and you'll find out later on why. And a lot of other people give me ideas in this one. So about me, we've heard a bit about that, but we actually have lived, my half family has lived in the Junction in Bloor West Village since the 1880s. I had one great grandfather who assembled bicycles. He built them. His family was all blacksmiths, and he had a shop first on Keele, first on Dundas, east of Keele, and then on Keele, north of Dundas. Another great grandfather had a furniture shop on Dundas as well. So it's a long history. I think Hope and our families probably knew each other back, 100 years ago.
Definitely.
I've lived in my family, Gilmore Avenue, Woodside, Dury Avenue, Willard. People lived all over it, but I personally lived in the area since 1994. We moved into our house, and my wife said, it's too small, we're going to be here for 7 years. I said, well, give us 10. And we're still here, who knows how much longer again. I have a degree in journalism from the Institute formerly known as Ryerson. And I'm now still working part-time, but I'm going to York University taking creative writing, one course a year. After 3 years of being there, I've been told I passed first year. But my very first job actually out of Ryerson was working for the Historical Society, doing an oral history for one summer. And I dug up some of that information. One of them was people I interviewed had a farm in the Humber Valley, pre-Hurricane Hazel, of course. But yeah, so I'm a long-term interest in this. So Runnymede. When I tell people where I live, I say I live near Bloor West Village, or near Babby Point, or near the Junction. It's in between. I never say Runnymede because nobody knows where it is, and when they think they do, they think of the road or the school, but not the neighborhood. And defining Runnymede has been a bit of my challenge. So this, what you see here, is from 1890s. I can't remember the exact date, I've got it written down somewhere. But this was one of the first things in terms of looking at the neighborhood and turning it into a community. And somebody had, all the red areas had been sold, and the rest were up for sale. And we'll talk a bit about that later on, because there was a fellow who was trying to start this off, and there's still some examples of the buildings he first built around. City of Toronto and the Toronto Real Estate Board consider this to be Runnymede. Anything going pretty much from Bloor Street up to Dundas and almost crossing onto the west side of James Street, north of Babby Point. But up on top of the hill, they consider that to be Runnymede as well. I don't. Anybody who lives there says we're Lambton. So, you know, this is what I consider Runnymede to be. I consider it this small area. It's Runnymede, Annette, Jane, and the railway tracks. So 700 by 800 square meters. Really small. There's, it's hard to find, nobody can give you the census data for specifically that area. I think it's around 2,000, 4,000 people. There's several hundred homes in there. You know, it's a substantial little community. Very, very small. And the reason I sort of partly focusing just in this area is people have written about that point. Obviously, people have written about the West Toronto Junction, and people have written about Bloor West Village as well, but not this area. So, Runnymede started off underwater. It was part of Lake Iroquois that went back 13,000 years before it started receding. It was almost flat. If you go and you walk that area, there are no hills, there are no valleys. There's not even, if something's more than a foot above ground, somebody's put it there as a vegetable garden. It's just flat because it was a beach. It was like a flat sandy beach, like you gone up to Wasaga or to Southampton or someplace, just smooth, flat, until it reaches just below Annette Street, and then it starts to dip off more dramatically and towards now Lake Ontario. And it's sand everywhere. That's all it was. And anybody, when we moved in, you know, my wife said, wow, is this ground ever sandy? Well, now we know why. It's just like thousands and thousands of years of sand deposits there. And it's not a great map, because there's no exact great map of this, but this is sort of, will give you some of the idea of the, where the lake went, Lake Iroquois went. So all of this area up through here was underwater, and up to, if anybody knows Lambton Arena, and Lambton Park, that's, if you look at that and you kick this dirt a bit, you'll see the sand. That's a great big sandbar. And that was the northernmost point of Lake Iroquois, and then it sort of, you know, curved around and then joined up with the Davenport Ridge, which we're just above Davenport Road. And so all of that area below was water. Yeah, it was really quite interesting to see that. Oh yeah, just before we go back on the sort of the plant life and the wildlife in the area, and I'm doing a lot of research on that. It was all sorts of different kinds of oak trees, white, red, black, and fir. And there's somebody on Annette Street, just west of Runnymede, who's got doing an exhibition down at A-Space based on their oak tree, which is at least 250 years old. And you just think about that, you know, way before anybody came in and started settling in the area, these trees were there, and they're still there. They didn't get all chopped down, which is really quite incredible. Selective, if they were going to put a house here, they would cut the tree there. If there was a tree right beside that space, they left it alone, which is why you've got these great oak trees 4 feet away from your foundation. But it wasn't just the oaks, there was beech, walnut, red and white pines, and butternut trees. And if you think of what Hyde Park looks like, in certain areas of it, and if you go up to Lambton Park, where it's lots of big trees, open space underneath, not a lot of brush, that's what Runnymede looked like. That's what this area looked like. It was just this great big oak savanna, lots of room for deer to run around, and strawberries and other kind of berries to grow, and really quite something. And it's important we look at for the indigenous era. So after like Iroquois receded, people started moving north as it started getting warmer and the ice receded, and they're not sure exactly time frame, but you know, we're talking 10,000–12,000 years ago, people started moving north, moved from the south side of Lake Iroquois and now the US, and moved up around. And this area, and for Runnymede, is kind of in between, it was sort of beside all the activity for indigenous community. The Humber River was really critical. It was critical for transportation to get from Lake Ontario up to Lake Simcoe. The Toronto carrying place is a 45-kilometer long walk where you could most easily get up to Lake Simcoe and the Holland River and Lake Simcoe. And it was along there that communities got set up. So the most famous one, and I'm going to say it wrong, Tiegon, where Babby Point is now, at one point had, they figured about 5,000 people from the Wendat Nation living there. 50 longhouses, a palisade, wall around it. And one of the things when you have a community that size, you gotta feed them. So my thinking, and there's no evidence of it, just my thinking, is that they would have used Runnymede, so to the east of Jade Street, use that for, first of all, hunting. That would have been hunted out pretty quickly, but gathering, so berries, and then also cultivation. So, because even though there's no rivers or anything going through there, or no streams, because of the sandy soil, there's actually quite a number of springs and meandering, mainly underground miniature streams that go through there. And so, in between, again, for the indigenous communities, but I think a really important component of how they feed themselves and for community as well. Then came the colonialist era. You know, the first ones, first people here were the French explorers. You know, it was a fellow Rousseau who set up a trading post at the mouth of the Humber. But it really wasn't until Lord Simcoe came along and you know, founded the colony of Upper Canada, and he was trying to do the effort of making the colony self-sustaining and also to provide, you know, the empire with ship masts and things like that, and lumber for their navy. And so going back to, you know, and again, it's Runnymede wasn't really part of that, but it was beside that. So all the mills that got created for doing things like lumber and grist mills for making grain, grinding grain, all those sorts of things were in the Humber Valley. But activity spilled up over onto the plain, what they called back then the plain. And so John Scarlett, who had several facilities down at the mouth of the Black Creek, where it merged in with the Humber River, he actually started doing things, building housing up his homes up on the plain. First at Keel and Dundas, that was his first home, and then after that at the top of what is now known as Runnymede Road. And that's in addition to Scarlet Road, which was a toll road, which he made money on, as people went to his mills to pay him to cut the lumber and grind their grain. There was a number of farms in the area. And again, we're only talking 700 by 800 meters, but there's at least 3 farms I know of. One on Dury, which is a dairy farm. There was one farm on James Street on the east side. Just north of the high school, there's an apartment building that used to be a market garden. And then there was another farm. It looks like there was another farm on my street, Beresford, at St. John, because there's a very old farm-style house there, and there's also a spring in the backyard, and so critical for water. Yes?
Excuse me, where was the one on Jury?
The one on Dury would be on the, anybody's been there, there used to be a really old bungalow that was set back from the road quite a bit, quite small. That was a farmhouse. And so it was on, the farm was on the west side of Dury, south of St. John. And there was a stream that ran from King George School. As it started, there was a spring there, and a stream that ran through, down through between Dury and Windermere, and then ended up somewhere just south of James Coleman Elementary School. And I kind of looked at King George, and the original King George School, which was at the front of the property, had a basement. The current school is at the back of the property, does not have a basement. And the reason it doesn't have a basement is because the spring is under there. So yeah, so it's sort of interesting, all these little bits and pieces. There's also a spring, anybody remembers where the beer store was? It didn't build that long ago, but the beer store up at Dundas, there used to be a spring under there as well. So it's little bits and pieces. Or somebody on our block who is swears they're really good at divining where water is, so I'm gonna get her out one day and get her around to confirm these spots. Yeah, so that's, and then there's orchards as well, it's the other thing. And so one of the orchards of record that I know of were the ones that we think predated James Batty, Batty Point, but there used to be orchards on Batty Point. And I'm assuming that there would have been orchards as well in the Runnymede area. So that's more information will come as I talk to more people. And then also, the original roads would have gone through here at that point. And I'm just still mapping them out, because Dundas is sort of would have been one of the first roads. Runnymede was one of the first roads of Bloor Street a long time ago. And railways. It's really quite fascinating. We had several different railways. We used to have a railway that only lasted for a couple of years, you can believe it, but it went up where basically Humbercrest is, going up through near the crest of the ridge of the Humber River. And then there was obviously the railway north of the city, north of going through, it's still there.
Yes. The railway on Humbercrest, where was it going?
Well, we'll show you a map later on. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting one. And then so the colonialist era, for all intents and purposes, lasted till about around 1880, 1890, because really there wasn't much development. It was all farmland and not many people living in the area. But around 1900, 1890, in that things started to get very active with the roads coming in, some of the railways coming in. It was easier for people to get out to the area, and people started to build. This really bad, I have yet to be able to get a good map of this, but this is a map of new construction dates that the city of Toronto does. And our area up in here is just all, it's all around 1900 to 1930. So Runnymede was basically built by 1930. And all of a sudden, it wasn't all one developer. It didn't work that way. It was, somebody bought a bunch of lots, and they developed them themselves, or they sold it off, and somebody built one, and they built one next door for, their family or something like that, or to sell to pay for their own home. On our block in Beresford, a lot of, and you can tell by, do the buildings look the same? And it's the same builder, pretty much. So on my block, it's all, on our side, it's pretty much all semi-detached. And they're all roughly the same, except for the one I live in and the attached one. And they're a bit wider and a bit taller because that was the builder, and he built for his $2.
And on Jury, where I live, the house neighboring is like a mirror of the other. So if you drew a line down the driveway, it's like symmetry, right? Like
Yep.
staircase on one side, staircase on the other side, living room plan, and so on.
Yeah. And you'll see, if you walk around, and that's what I do, is I walk around and say, what's different from what I see? So I go on Windermere, just south of St. John's, and there's these big, giant old Victorian homes. Well, those were the only homes that they were built on from this Runnymede estate concept, where it was going to be this lovely sort of, I guess at that point it would have been upper middle class neighborhood, and there's a couple of them on St. John's east of Runnymede as well, on the south side. You see those, all built at the same time, the same red brick, and tall, really tall buildings with arches. And they were built slightly before everybody else had done. That's what the area would have looked like if Runnymede Estates had been completed the way it is. And then you look around and you say, why is this piece of property, why is there a row of townhouses on St. John across the street from King George? Well, because there used to be a church there. There used to be the Baptist church. They ran out of parishioners, and they sold off the property, and so you have townhouses. You go down onto Annette Street, and there's this condo. It's 4-story, 5-story condo. Where did that come from? Where did they get the property for that? Well, that used to be, TTC used to run the electric trolley buses on Annette. That used to be the substation for the power for the trolleys. And so when they stopped doing that, they finally sold the property off, and we got a condo. If you go up on the Dundas Street, Martino Brothers, the auto body repair place, they used to own the car wash.
Yeah.
Well, that car wash, which used to, prior to that, had been a parking lot for the company, was before Cintas, before the place where they do all the uniforms. That used to be some sort of steel manufacturing place. The parking lot, because it became the car wash, and car wash business got too cutthroat, too many, and then it became, apartments. So you look at a piece of property, and if it doesn't seem to fit in, there's a story behind it.
Do you notice that a lot of the streets have changed names too, even some of the ones you showed earlier?
Yeah.
Do you find that was it when those developments happened that those street names changed?
No, what would happen is, and this happened, when Mike Harris decided that the 6 cities that made up Toronto were going to become one, there had to be some name changes because it would be the same name, and so Louisa, Runnymede used to be called Elizabeth, but there's Elizabeth Street downtown. So the more important street got to keep the name.
That happened in 1909 when West Toronto joined the city.
Yeah.
Because of the conflict in there.
Yeah. So that's the name change, you know, and sometimes they went to 2 or 3 names. You know, there's 2 or 3 small streets, they're like 1 block, east-west streets, and some of them gone through 3 name changes.
Well, especially north of Bloor, like Beresford was Peel and
Yep.
Jury was still Jury, but then Windermere was called something else.
Oh, and Beresford was Peel, south of St. John's.
Right.
North of St. John's, it was Princess.
Right.
Because of 2 different municipalities. It was York North and West Toronto Junction, the city south.
Yeah. So it's just, yeah, so studying through all these kinds of things it's been kind of interesting. The other thing, you know, transit, and I've just been delving into this a fair bit, and of course, you know, our transit history in Runnymede is partly the transit history of West Toronto Junction. But, you know, in our little 600 by 700, 700 by 800 meter facility, you know, neighborhood has 7 different transit routes serving it. You know, it's really quite incredible. And at one point in time, obviously, there was the Junction streetcar that went through. At one point, they were going to put a streetcar through on Annette Street, all the way to Babby Point, but the Depression hit. So there went that idea, they ran out of money. You know, the train, you know, CPR used to have a station in Lambton, in addition to the one in West Toronto. You know, the train that went up along the ridge of the Humber, they had a station that was now at Florence and roughly Florence and St. Clair, so just north of Runnymede. So just, you know, just a lot of bus and trolleys and trains, really quite something. And a lot of businesses, you know, for a community that doesn't have its own real business district. I don't consider Dundas a district, I consider it as a strip mall for everybody else but people living in our neighborhood. But it's just amazing. I went through and I counted up. I actually went through and walked the streets. Okay, that was, you know, there's 97, it's 97 storefronts between Annette, Jane, there's a few on Runnymede, and on Dundas. 97. On St. John's alone, from Runnymede all the way over to Humbercrest, there used to be 27 stores. There would be butchers, greengrocers, dry goods, you know, dry cleaners. And it was like you didn't have to go anywhere. Before people had, you know, access to cheap cars, you know, you would have stuff delivered. So you would pick up your phone, you'd call in your order to Foodland on St. John's, and you would, you know, say, I want da 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 da. Some kid who was trying to earn a few bucks after school would cycle the stuff down to you. It would go onto your tab, and at the end of the month, you'd settle up. Talk about convenience. And so it's kind of interesting watching the ebb and flow of this. From all these businesses, you know, all the cafes and dry cleaners and all that sort of started to fade away and disappear. You know, I think I counted at one time, you know, we had 5 convenience stores. We're down to 7-Eleven. As cars became, you know, the way to go, and you could travel to a bigger superstore somewhere, buy goods, or go to Dufferin Mall or Sherway Gardens or someplace. All the small places started to close up, and they only stayed open because, you know, people lived upstairs, they owned the place, and, you know, it didn't make sense to sell because where would they move? So they started closing up, but then something happened. The counter car culture started to kick in, partly thanks to COVID, and all these small places that have been boarded up have now now opened up again. So all of a sudden, we've got like 5 cafes. But interestingly, for our little neighborhood in the middle of nowhere, in between everything else, here's, on Dundas, it's really exciting with all the live clubs and that. We've actually got 5 places where you can hear live music in our little space. We've got the Annette Studio, which is mainly a recording studio, but they have concerts on Annette Street. We've got Cafe, I'll never say this properly. You'll correct me immediately, thanks Mario. Cafe Easy. Geely, thank you. Live music on Saturday afternoons. You go up onto Dundas, there's the Cat, there's the Tale of the Junction. All these places have, and there's a 5th one up there. And they all have live music. It's kind of interesting. So all these things happen in places that, doing something quite differently before. And the other thing with urbanization is, of course, everybody at some point in time went to a church or some religious institution. So, but we've only actually lost 2. At one point there's 5. There's the St. James Catholic, there's Runnymede Presbyterian, there's the Grace of the Nazarene, which is a Wesleyan Christian church. There used to be the mosque, well there's still a mosque there, sorry. And there used to be the Buddhist temple, which has moved up into the Junction, and then St. John's Baptist Church, which is now row housing. So it's really quite interesting that after all that, all the churches in the Junction that are now condos, we've only lost 2 of the potential 7. Yeah, so that's and then so a wide range of cultural and social stuff that has evolved over time. At one point in time, tennis was really big. My dad, who went to St. Paul's Anglican Church in Willard, one of the big things, the attractive points was you could play tennis there. And where the daycare has their outdoor space, that used to be a tennis court. The Baptist Church in St. John's used to have a tennis court. Runnymede Collegiate used to have a tennis court. And everybody would compete and hope to be able to go play over Batting Point tennis court, so it was nice to see. And we had a lot of interesting people that grew up in the area. Anybody recognize him? J.P. Subban is now a TV personality, but he and his brothers went to Runnymede Collegiate. His dad, I found out, was principal at Warren Park Public School, and one of the things he made sure was that everybody learned how to skate. We had a war hero, actually grew up in Beresford. We'll get into him in a little bit. Basson's. So this is guy, Solomon Basson. I talked about these little stores. Well, this guy, Solomon, had a mini chain of grocery stores. He had like 5 of them in the end. He had one at Jane and Annette. He had one down on Bloor Street, and he had a few others. It ended up being bought up by Offshore Group, which then of course got bought up by Sobeys, which who knows what get bought up by next. But he, so he's this little guy, he's got a grocery store, he lives upstairs over it. He went to Knesset Israel, that was his synagogue. And all of a sudden, one day, a lawyer shows up with a summons for him. Well, apparently, he made the terrible mistake of selling shredded wheat made by Kellogg's. A great sin back then. Apparently, according to the Shredded Wheat Company of the UK, he was suing Kellogg's for patent infringement. And they decided to not only sue Kellogg's, but to pick one of the retailers, and so they went after Solomon. So they went through this really lengthy trial. And in the end, Kellogg's paid all the legal fees. But in the end, shredded wheat company of the UK, just lost the court case because they were suing here in Canada. If they sued in the UK, they probably would have won. But just a fascinating story. And I talked to his grandnephew, and he didn't even know the story. It was really quite fascinating. And the other thing we found out is that, and the reason I found them, is I spoke to his son's wife, whose family ran another fruit and vegetable stand up at St. Clair and Bathurst. And so I guess once you're in the business, you just marry within the business, because you don't want people to understand what it means to do that. So it's a really fascinating person. Marcus Rawson, the last name on the list, he's the guy that wanted to develop Runnymede Estates. So he and his family came to Toronto probably the 1830s, so really early on. It still wasn't a city yet. It didn't become a city till 1848. He was a jeweler, family of jewelers. They invested their profits into a hotel called the Rawson Hotel, which became the ultimate, the best hotel in Toronto at that point in time. And you can tell how good it is, because if you go back and you look at old newspaper articles, they'll actually they'll list who stayed at what hotel. As like, no privacy. But it actually, so it was now, it's like, so-and-so, the mayor of Sudbury or something like that, stayed at the Rawson Hotel. And it was quite fascinating. So he and his family, and like John Scarlett, Rawson, because of the same era, they didn't stick to their knitting, just on their business. They started investing in other things. So both cases, Scarlett invested in a bank, one of the many small banks that used to be here in Ontario, where you print your own money, kind of like cryptocurrency. And Rawson invested in an insurance company. But then the hotel burned down, and that, for some reason, I don't know the details, of wiped everything out for them. They ran out, all their money was gone, and they had to abandon the Runnymede Estates development plan. So, certain people in the crowd cannot participate, because we've already done this one. So, we're going to test everything you know or don't know about Runnymede. Name the war hero who grew up in Beresford. Was it John Scarlett, John Simcoe, Fred Topham, or Gene Flat Davy? Yeah, you can't answer that.
I mean, this is related to my project.
I know, but that's what.
That's the clue.
There you go.
Clap for him in front of me.
He, and I've got a small book I've done about him over the side there. But he was with the Airborne Regiment in World War II, dying days of World War II. They parachute in. He's fixing up people, his fellow soldiers who hurt themselves when they parachuted in. He finds there's some people being shot at. Other medics are going in trying to save them. They get shot and killed. He goes in, saves them, gets shot in the nose in the process, drags them back. Then later in the day, he goes saves people from a burning personnel carrier. So for that, he got the Victoria Cross. Fascinating guy. Lots of recognition back here. Didn't want any of it. But even after he got back, he joined the police force. That didn't really work out for him. And then he went and worked for Toronto Hydro. And when he was working for Toronto Hydro, he saved somebody else. He you just can't stop it. Jean Flatt Davy, another really important person in Canadian military history, she was the first female doctor to be a commissioned officer of the Canadian Armed Forces, and she was awarded the Officer of the Order of the British Empire. So, a hero in her own right. Also, I should note that Dennis Flynn, he used to be the mayor of Etobicoke, he served in the same regiment as Fred Topp. So, probably he bandaged him up at some point.
Didn't Topham die falling off of a ladder in the end?
Yes,
Yeah.
Very simple.
So, I mean, like, think of all the things that he did, and then he has a really tragic fall in that.
Yeah. Okay, Loblaws, we all know where it is right now. And where was it first located?
774 next street.
That was the second location. What was the first one? Nope.
Well, it was actually 777 in that street, but for a few years, the two of them were side by side.
Side by side, yeah. Yeah, so 779 on the south, so it became Warden Patch, and now it's known as Valley Point Hardware. We had our own Runnymede library, called the Runnymede Library, and that's a picture of it. Yeah, not exactly the same beautiful edifice we have down on Bloor Street now, but where was it? King George, corner of Jane and Dundas, corner of Willard and Monty, or where James Cullen School is now located? Any thoughts, guesses? Okay, it was at the corner of Willard and Monty. Wasn't there for very long. Where did Runnymede Road first end?
North or south?
Sorry?
North or south?
Well, you know too much. So Runnymede started at Bloor Street originally, and it was John Scarlett's driveway. That's how he got, because there was no roads, when he first moved there, there was no roads north of Bloor. Dundas Street did not exist at that point. And his home was up at, basically at St. Clair. No, farther south?
Dundas and St. John's Place.
Dundas and St. John's Place. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. I'm learning something. Okay, where are we top? We know where Runnymede Road first start, which was Bloor Street. Okay, used to be horses were an active part of transportation in our lives. Where do you think they used to live? They used to be Campbell and Meadow, so that's the corner of Dundas and Jane, 533 Beresford, the Windermere Laneway, or Martina Willis Collision.
All of the above?
No.
Well, they do important.
Yeah.
How far, what's the crossroad of 533 Beresford? South of St. John's?
It's at Annette.
Annette.
Yeah. So 533 Beresford is a one house up from Annette Street, and it was in behind the Runnymede Dairy, and that's where they used to keep the horses. My dad, when he was a kid, he's 95, almost 96, so it's more than a few years ago. He would, as a kid, would go there and feed carrots to the horses after school. Yes.
Where was the Runnymede Dairy?
It's on Annette Street. There's a development of there's a cannabis shop, there's the bridal shop, and a real estate agent. So they were in there. That was that space. And the other one was Dury and Windermere Laneway. So I remember telling you there used to be a farm on Dury, and somebody who was part of that farm also had and the barn is still there. It's a very small barn, but it's kind of unique because it's got a second floor where you used to store the hay, and he used to do delivery services out of there. Yeah, and there's the dairy.
I think the mosque is, like,
where the wall
the
is.
Monday Mosque is to the left of the picture.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Okay, railway quiz. First name of the railway running through Runnymede. Nope.
Beltline. Beltline.
We're, not this one.
Crooked Valley.
Crooked Valley, there you go.
It's right there.
And where was the station? Anybody know offhand where the station was for that? So it was sort of west, almost out where the Toronto Community Housing is. It's in that area. And there used to be a short-lived train line I talked about earlier. It actually ran from as part of the Beltline, and it was supposed to, you could actually do a circle of the city. So you know where the Beltline is through Rosedale and Forestville and all through that. Well, that is that extended out, was going to go all the way down through along the Humber, down the Lakeshore, and around. So you could actually do a complete circuit. You know, it's like the original GO train or up. You know, just get you around quite nicely, but there wasn't enough traffic for it. And they were planning to pay for it by selling land farther north. I didn't break down, but where the Beltline was going in the northern component, they had a whole chunk of land, like CPR did. You know, they were given land to go and sell to be able to pay for the railway. Well, this was the same idea. They acquired this chunk of land, you know, hundreds of acres, and then sell it off and, you know, pay for that, and then hopefully build up some traffic. Yeah, and across Dundas, it's across Dundas. There's a really interesting laneway between Humbercrest and what's the name of that street? Brookside, thank you. That's a really extra wide laneway, and that's where the train went up, and the tracks went through. Dundas crossed. Somehow they crossed the CPR line, and there was the train station, which the photo here. No, I don't. But it became a train station was there for quite a while, and was inhabited until the 1950s as home. So one of the interesting things that really got me going was Madeline Dallas said, there used to be a golf course in the area. Really? So I started researching, and this guy, Archibald Gilchrist, who owned property at the south end of my block, so, you know, on Beresford, just north of that, gave his land to start up a golf course. Now, anybody's been on Beresford, the property I researched that he's got like 10 lots. You couldn't even get a mini golf on there. So, but the original charter for the Highlands Golf Club was to build a course somewhere north of Annette and between Runnymede and Jane. So one of the things I found out is that golf courses back then, they weren't necessarily played on people's own property, on the golf club property. They would just get out there and whack the ball down whatever field it was, and somebody would set up a hole someplace and they just keep playing like that. And supposedly that's how there used to be a golf club on Spadina, and that's how they would play. I haven't confirmed any of all of this, but this is, you know, this is what I've been told. So it's possible that they played on Beresford, but they have evidence, you know, documented stuff that shows they actually had a golf course set up on Dundas, west of Jake, and because there's a golf, they had their clubhouse there, and which they sold in 1906. So they're only there for a few years. So I've done a little small book called Pop-Up Golf Course, because it's just like you expect a golf course to be there forever, like Lambton, which has been there since 1906. But it just, you know, they because they didn't own the land where they played on, they had to keep moving, because people keep developing it under them. So they had this clubhouse, which is the Legion on Dundas. So it's on where the parking lot is. And supposedly there was a restaurant in the clubhouse, and the Legion ended up owning it at one point, but I'm still researching that. But they did play there. They had their annual meetings in the West Toronto City Hall, and they, every week during the season, Globe and Mail report on how people did. And it's one of the, I guess one of the few sports at that point in time where it was integrated between men and women. So you'd see, men's matches and women's matches, but then you would see mixed couple matches. And they would play a lot of inter-club matches. So there was also a golf course in Morningside. So Highlands would play Morningside, they would play Brampton, they would play Spadina, all these different places. Really quite, there was like 200 members of the club, 216 members. So really quite an interesting little thing, and just, learning how they, dealt with, cutting lawns, and doing things like that, very different. So that's what I've done. I've been working on, and it's in progress. I'm working every day and writing the book. I've done, as I come across really interesting things, I do what I call these little small books. So really, a lot of information about a very specific topic. So I got the pop-up golf course, which is, of the Highlands Golf Club, which ended up, when I said, I got a lot of support from the Mississauga Golf and Country Club, that's where Highlands moved. And the first one I did was on Fred Topham. So that's what I've been doing so far. My next steps is, I'm calling it tentatively the neighborhood that disappeared. So in 1899, this is St. Clair, before it was called Davenport. This is Dundas. You can see the line there for Toronto Junction. So this is, at that point, would have been called Elizabeth Street, which was named after John Scarlett's second wife, or his third child. Don't know yet. And you can see the CPR railway line going through there. But up here is Walmart, right? Down here, you've got Fresco, you got Cintas, you've got Canada Metal, and you've got a growing number of self-storage units along here. These, at one point, were designed to be residential. And you can see these little boxes show where there's buildings. All sorts of buildings. This one supposedly, and this is, I'm going to the archives tomorrow, supposed to have been what Josh Kaminsky from Canada Iron and Metal calls an Indian trading house. So who knows what exactly it is, but it's supposedly something to do with indigenous people. Anyways, so I'm going to find out who lived in these places, and start to track them when they disappeared. As you can see, there's even streets here that no longer exist. Imagine, this is where the underpass is. Sorry, I gotta get out of people's way here. And there was a street called Elm Street that went along there. Long gone. Thomas, Charles, James, those are streets that probably never even built. So that goes back to 1899. 1926, you can see it's changed a lot. So north of the area, this is all, so you've got the railway yards over there, but over here, it's there's nothing. And there's a few buildings along through there. You know, Elm Street is now got changed, its name got changed to Raynol, you know, but now, you know, there's, you know, it's all industrial or commercial. And talking to a few people who've been around the neighborhood for a long time, they remember some of these buildings still being there. But I think they said the last got torn down in the 50s. And of course, this is what it looks like today. And that's my presentation, and this is how you find me. I've got business cards back there that has all this information, but I've got a specific blog for the history. I've got a blog on my sort of things I write, like Vesuvio's, Friday Night at Vesuvio's, and other sort of memoir kinds of things, and my website. So, and I've got my 2 small books over there available. And thank you very much for listening.
Time for a few questions, if anybody has any questions?
Of course. Yes.
I read Alan Redway's History of East York, and he says in there that Topham was an East York warrior.
Well, he was born and raised on Beresford. However, there is a park in East York called Topham Park, which is also a housing development, which was specifically for, was built after World War II with a sort of military theme on it. I think it was for returning war veterans.
That's right.
There's also a pond up at Eglinton Jane. More of a reservoir, I guess. It's called Topham Pond or Topham Lake. But yeah, so there's, but yeah, no, it's definitely it's still definitely a West Ender. Okay. Richard.
Jim, in all my years in living in this part of the city, I always wondered why Runnymede Collegiate was on Jane and not I'm kind of getting a hint that it's because of Runnymede Estate as opposed to Runnymede Road. But do you
Haven't got there yet.
have got there? Okay. A mystery still to unravel.
My first thing was understanding why it was called Collegiate Institute, but I've got that information. So at one point in time, by the way, is if you, in order to get the Collegiate Institution designation, you had to have a certain percentage of your teachers had to have PhDs, and there were certain standards you had to maintain. But that's all long gone. Anything else? Oh, yes.
So I live on a street on the other side, and I was told that my houses are are built for the manufacturing up in the Junction region. But many of the house, like I live on our street, there's 2 houses. That is it. It's blocked, but there's only 2 types of houses. But
Yep.
some, we see the same house plan on the other side that you were talking about when we walk around. Are those buildings for the same purpose? Do you
Yeah,
think?
no, that's an interesting one, and I have a personal interest in this too, because my grandparents had one of those houses. There was 2 styles, and they were built after World War I, because guess what, Toronto had a housing crisis. Been there, done that before. So they had, I think it was really just two styles, and you'll see them mainly in the, sort of North Runnymede, after their web, because that was one of the last places, that was one of the last empty places, and properties. And so they had the 2 styles, and they built those. Yes?
There's an article about, written by Dave Muir on our.
Yes, they had. Yeah, and Dave and I talked a lot about that, and I can't remember the price of that when my grandparents bought it was, can't even buy a shed for that price anymore.
And to the connection to the they walk the streets and how many people live in Runnymede too, and we should talk about how many of them were there, but I would hazard to guess between 60 and 100 in First and Second World War that would have left on all of those streets, on Beresford North, Drury, St. John's. I mean, St. John's Road, I remember Madeline walking along, doing a walking tour. She said between Runnymede and Jane, there were 26 butcher shops.
Yeah.
Mostly on the south side of St.
Yeah.
John's.
Yeah.
But, I mean, and if it weren't people living in houses there, they were working within the community in any event. So when you look at the wartime loss in the First World War and the Second World War and then the aftermath of that, how much the community would have shifted significantly for booming families, for disjointed families and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to see the crossover of those stories.
Okay.
How did Runnymede get its name?
Well, so John Scarlett, that's where it came from. It is originally, as John Scarlett called his home Runnymede House, and just, I think it's Marcus Rawson liked it and used that for calling it Runnymede Estates. Dan, you've got more information on the end.
It was originally Elizabeth Street.
Yes.
And it changed to Runnymede Road when it joined Toronto.
Yes, yeah, that's the,
1909.
but the name Runnymede overall.
Yeah.
That's the origins of it, yeah.
So was the name Runnymede, is that like a holdover from England or something?
Well, yeah, that's,
John Scarlett was English.
yeah, that's right, it's a Magna Carta was signed, and Scarlett had a strong sense of English history, and so he decided to call it Runnymede. I can't remember, he obviously had it done on Keel, and a different name.
He just had a house on the Keel. One of his sons had a house on the Keel.
Okay.
And one of his relatives had acreage on the Pacific and his wife is one of his third or fourth wife, whatever. His relative Thompson had a house at
Okay, I think we should wrap things up. We have some time to hang around and some refreshments and socialize and whatever. But I want to thank Jim for a great presentation.